Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things and unexpected discoveries you can make if you just take the time to learn. I'm Mark, and I'm going to be your host this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. And together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. How's it going, Joe?
It's going okay, Mark. Good to talk to you again. I am curious about one thing, though. Are you getting excited about the possibility of the Mariners breaking the terrible playoff drought if they can just win out this weekend? What do you think?
Well, I might be ridden out of Seattle on a rail because of this answer, but no, I am not excited about that, and I'll tell you why. I remain convinced that the Mariners are not a good team. They are well over 500, but their run differential is still negative 50.
Is it really? Oh, my God.
So I feel like this is a bad team that has gotten lucky and is concealing itself within, the clothing of good teams. And so my perspective on these sorts of things is that there are two ways to be interesting as a sports team. You can either be really good or really bad, and both of those poles are interesting. Like everyone loves to watch a championship team, and a team that's just has gone 19 years without making the playoffs. That makes the Mariners interesting. That's an interesting storyline about the Mariners. And if they sneak in as the last wild card team and break that string, there will be nothing that's still interesting about the Mariners. They'll be just one more team in Major League Baseball. So
right.
I want to see them break the string, but I want to see them break the string as a strong club, as a baseball team that other baseball teams are concerned about playing.
Yeah.
And I just don't feel like that's this year's Mariners squad. So no, I'm rooting for the other guys this year. So this week's question has been something that's been sort of banging around in the back of my head for a while, because I would call myself a moderate Harry Potter fan. I read all the books and I saw all the movies. And I've always thought that J.K. Rowling is one of the good guys because I really like her story as, a single mother working as a secretary who shopped her book around to, I think it was 50 publishers before she found someone who would finally publish it. And then once she made incredible amounts of money, she seemed to continue to be a very solid person. And so it surprised me when she re-entered the news as a vocal advocate of denying rights to transsexuals within the UK. I went a little bit down the rabbit hole of reading up about something called a TERF, a trans-exclusionary radical feminist, which I had never heard of before this. And it seemed to me like a radically polarized landscape in which I simply did not understand what was going on. So I sent you down that rabbit hole, Joe, to hopefully help me understand what is the deal with TERFs, where did that term come from, and why are Rowling and some other feminists so adamantly opposed to legislation in support of transsexuals?
All right. Well, not only did you send me down a rabbit hole, but you sent me into an active battlefield in the culture wars. And I have to admit, I'm a little nervous about that. Because I feel like there are like IEDs waiting everywhere on this battlefield. And judging from the way this war has been fought to date, I feel like what I say in this presentation can and will be used against me in the court of social media.
Yes.
So in answering your question, I feel like I'm one errant thought away from being canceled. And for that reason, Mark, I've decided to enter the Federal Identity Politics Witness Protection Program. After we tape this episode, I will be whisked away to an undisclosed location to assume my new identity. And I can't tell you anything else at this point, except that my new name will be the artist formerly known as Joe.
Okay. I will remember that for the next episode of this podcast, formerly Joe.
Okay, good. This question is really complicated. And I have to admit to my shame and chagrin that I had never heard the expression TERF before you mentioned it last time either. In fact, I needed to keep a glossary of LGBTQ terminology close at hand throughout my research because of the sheer amount of jargon in this field. And I'm going to define some key terms as we go along, but for each term I define, there are 10 other relevant terms or concepts that our limited time doesn't permit me to discuss. Though I'm going to try my best to describe the conflict between trans activists and feminists fairly and accurately, I'll just be scratching the surface of the debates about biological sex, gender identity, and transgender rights that are raging right now in this country and abroad. A journalist named Helen Joyce at The Economist magazine wrote a 311-page book on this very subject that just came out a few weeks ago. Given our constraints here, I'm going to limit myself to your narrow question about TERF and how it came to be used to describe J.K. Rowling. And then the artist formerly known as Joe will add a few thoughts at the end. As you mentioned in your question, the acronym TERF stands for Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminist. It refers to feminists who exclude the rights of transgender women from their advocacy of women's rights. My wife helpfully pointed out to me that TERF is a name given to one group of people by another group of people. Most people accused of being TERFs reject the name as neither neutral nor descriptive of their beliefs. Some think it's downright defamatory and prefer to identify themselves as gender critical. I'll say more about both sides' views in a few minutes. For now, remember that when I refer to TERFs, the people I'm talking about reject that label as incorrect and demeaning. TERF was coined in 2008 by a blogger for Guardian Australia named Viv Smythe, who was expressing her frustration at what she described as, quote, one cohort of feminists who self-identify as radical and are unwilling to recognize trans women as sisters, end quote, which serves to, quote, deny their womanhood and exclude them, end quote. Now, the Wikipedia definition of TERF adds some details, like this. Quote, the term originally applied to the minority of feminists espousing sentiments that other feminists considered transphobic, such as the rejection of the assertion that trans women are women, the exclusion of trans women from women's spaces, and opposition to transgender rights legislation. The meaning has since expanded to refer more broadly to people with trans-exclusionary views who may have no involvement with radical feminism, end quote. Now, I think that last sentence is important because from what I've gleaned from my reading, the RF part of TERF is not the relevant part as it relates to your question. It's true that self-proclaimed radical feminists in the 1970s were the first ones to express the views that are now called TERF. The TE part of TERF, the contention made by trans activists that the views of people like J.K. Rowling are trans-exclusionary, that's the relevant part.
Okay, so what you're saying is that there's a coalition of trans-exclusionary people, some of whom are feminists, but it's not exclusively a feminist realm.
Yes, I am saying that. I think the feminists are most closely identified with this position, but it's not exclusive to them.
Yeah, I certainly didn't think it was exclusive to them. In my case, it was just a state of surprise that an otherwise progressive body would take a stance which my knee-jerk response would term as more reactionary than progressive. But yes, I get your point.
Yeah, so let's talk more about what it means to be trans-exclusionary. First, we need to know what transgender means. The Human Rights Campaign publishes a helpful glossary of LGBTQ-related terms on its website. This is the glossary that I had handy that I referenced before. HRC's definition of transgender is this, quote, an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and or expression is different from cultural expectations based on the sex they were assigned at birth, end quote. So let's unpack that. That difference creates a condition called gender dysphoria, which the HRC glossary defines as, quote, clinically significant distress caused when a person's assigned birth gender is not the same as the one with which they identify, end quote. Trans activists believe that trans women are women because even though their assigned biological sex is male, their gender identity is female, and gender identity trumps biology. As to the word assigned, the HRC glossary defines the sex assigned at birth as, quote, the sex, male, female, or intersex, that a doctor or midwife uses to describe a child at birth based on their external anatomy, end quote, which implies both that biological sex is not binary and that the assigning of a newborn baby's sex can be arbitrary. TERFs are seen as trans-exclusionary because TERFs believe that biological sex is immutable, but that gender identity is not. Many older feminists, for example, believe that gender is a fluid concept floating around outside one's sense of self, and that the patriarchy, that is men, have used so-called gender differences to deny women's autonomy. For those feminists and other so-called TERFs, referring to trans women by their preferred pronouns is a courtesy extended for the sake of social harmony, but it doesn't reflect the literal truth. TERFs believe that trans women are not women, they're men, because women have XX chromosomes and trans women were born XY. Trans women, as biological men, are therefore not eligible for women's rights, which accrue only to people born XX, a group that includes trans men. For trans activists, the TERF's insistence on labeling trans women as men constitutes bigotry. They call it misgendering, quote unquote, and claim that it's both deeply hurtful and often dangerous to trans people. They think that gender identity is innate, that it's the most fundamental thing about a person, and whatever gender a person feels that they are inside should determine how they're treated outside, in society. For example, what bathroom they use, or whether they're identified as male or female on their driver's license.
There's one part of that, of what you just went through, that's still confusing me. So you said that the trans-exclusionary, the TERFs, essentially, they do see gender as fluid, but they see sex as immutable. But, like, what is woman and man except gender categories? So how do they get from the one to the other? Because it seems like the trans activists are saying that gender is the thing that shows up socially, and that's what's important. And the TERFs agree that gender is fluid, and yet they also insist on biological primacy. I'm just not following through on that.
Yeah, well, I think it will become easier to understand when we see the concrete, what the TERFs claim are the concrete implications of having gender identity trump biology.
Mm-hmm.
And that's inextricably bound up with the issue with J.K. Rowling and what she was assailed for, which I'll get into shortly. But I will take this moment to say that I encourage everybody, you, Mark, and our listeners, to consult the HRC glossary, which I'm going to post as the first link in my sources for this episode on our Facebook page, because it really clarifies a lot of this terminology, and it must be hard for people to keep some of this straight if they're not steeped in these issues.
Right.
So what does all of this have to do with J.K. Rowling? Well, I'll tell you. In December 2019, Rowling tweeted her support of a British woman named Maya Forstater, who had been fired from her job as a researcher for a think tank called the Centre for Global Development. Forstater had tweeted her opposition to a reform to the UK's Gender Recognition Act that would have allowed biologically male people to self-identify their gender as female and change their birth certificates without a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. The reform didn't pass in the UK, but similar bills have passed in other European countries and in some states in the USA in recent years. Forstater, a self-described feminist, thought self-ID was a bridge too far and would potentially open many women's spaces to people who are not biologically female. Here are excerpts from a couple of Forstater's tweets. 1. Quote, some transgender people have cosmetic surgery, but most retain their birth genitals. Everyone's equality and safety should be protected, but women and girls lose out on privacy, safety, and fairness if males are allowed into changing rooms, dormitories, prisons, sports teams, end quote. Here's another. Quote, yes, I think that male people are not women. I don't think being a woman/female is a matter of identity or womanly feelings. It is biology. If people find the basic biological truth that trans women are male offensive, then they will be offended, end quote. Forstater argued that instead of allowing for self-ID, we should instead, quote, make space for a broader national conversation about how to reconcile the welfare of people who seek treatment for gender dysphoria and the basic human rights of women and girls, end quote. Forstater was terminated by her employer after her tweets received a fierce public backlash from trans activists and others who accused her of being transphobic. She insisted that she's not transphobic, but was simply worried about the effect the new law would have on women and girls. She said she was, quote, concerned that governments around the world are rushing through laws and policies which say that people with male bodies can become women simply by identifying as women. This is happening without adequate consideration for the impact on women's privacy, safety, and inclusion, end quote. She sued her employer over her termination and lost, the employment judge writing that Forstater's view that a trans woman can't honestly describe herself as a woman was, quote, absolutist, incompatible with human dignity and the fundamental rights of others, and unworthy of respect in a democratic society, end quote. A day after that decision came down, and this is an employment tribunal in the UK, J.K. Rowling tweeted her support for Forstater as follows. I quote again, dress however you please, call yourself whatever you like, sleep with any consenting adult who will have you, live your best life in peace and security, but force women out of their jobs for stating that sex is real? Hashtag I stand with Maya, end quote.
Again, I find that a little problematic. Do you agree that she was fired because people are saying sex isn't real? I don't believe that that's what the ruling was.
I hear you. I think her tweet was inelegantly worded, and that's one of the reasons she got in such hot water. Right after she sent this tweet, it generated widespread criticism. The backlash on social media was immediate. For example, the LGBTQ media advocacy group GLAAD tweeted in response to Rowling that her view, quote, denies the basic humanity of people who are transgender. Trans and non-binary people are not a threat to women, and to imply otherwise puts trans people at risk, end quote. Rowling later reported that she received death threats on Twitter. It's hard not to come away from hearing all of this thinking, don't tweet anything ever.
Yes, Twitter's never been a good forum for reasoned, careful discourse. It's a forum for shouting.
Right. But this whole round one played out on Twitter, which is one of the reasons why I think we got where we got. But Rowling responded in June 2020 with a 3,500-word essay on her website offering a comprehensive explanation of her gender-critical views and how she came to them. Here are some highlights. She complained about the bullying tactics of the trans activists who assailed her on social media. She argued against the transitioning of minors, citing, quote, studies that have consistently shown that between 60% and 90% of gender dysphoric teens will grow out of their dysphoria, end quote. She cited other statistics in order to posit what Helen Joyce calls the quote-unquote social contagion argument, that we're manufacturing gender dysphoria at hitherto unseen rates, especially among teenagers, because the culture is encouraging people to feel estranged from their sexed bodies. She stated that, quote, one of the objectives of denying the importance of sex is to erode the unifying realities that make women a cohesive political class, end quote. Rowling expressed her frustration that, quote, it isn't enough for women to be trans allies. Women must accept and admit that there is no material difference between trans women and themselves. I refuse to bow down to a movement that I believe is doing demonstrable harm in seeking to erode woman as a political and biological class and offering cover to predators, end quote. And perhaps most notably, she divulged that she was a victim of sexual abuse and assault and explained how that informed her views about maintaining safe spaces for women. The essay garnered both criticism and praise from some unlikely places. Daniel Radcliffe, the actor who played Harry Potter, wrote that, quote, transgender women are women. Any statement to the contrary erases the identity and dignity of transgender people and goes against all advice given by professional health associations who have far more expertise on this subject than either Joe or I, end quote. Meanwhile, Ralph Fiennes, who played Harry Potter's nemesis, Lord Voldemort, tweeted out his support for Rowling. I'm sure trans activists found it oddly fitting that Voldemort was pro-Rowling while Harry Potter was anti.
Yeah, I'm sure someone noticed that. I don't know if you picked it up in your research, but Rowling's most recent book is a mystery novel in which a murderous trans woman is the villain.
Now, that's interesting because I did read that she had done a lot of research into these issues precisely because of her new mystery book. But I didn't know what the mystery book was about, so you just filled in some blanks for me. Now, I want to say more about gender-critical people and their views to kind of flesh out where Rowling is coming from. Gender-critical theorists maintain that biological sex is both real and immutable and should not be conflated with gender identity, which is anything but innate. Their argument is articulated well by the philosopher Kathleen Stock, who writes, quote, gender-critical feminists particularly rebel against the idea, implicit in gender identity theory, that what makes you a woman or a man is a feeling, end quote, since that feeling bumps up against certain biological facts. Stock continues, quote, I recognize the importance of the concept of gender identity for trans people, but it can't be forced onto women like me who regard questioning gender roles while advocating on behalf of our sex as the whole point of feminism, end quote. Guardian columnist Suzanne Moore summarized the gender-critical position this way, I quote again, the radical insight of feminism is that gender is a social construct, that girls and women are not fated to be feminine, that boys and men don't have to be masculine. But we have gone through the looking glass and are being told that sex is a construct, that sex is merely assigned at birth rather than being a material fact, that gender is material and therefore can be possessed by whoever claims it, and it is sex as a category that is a social construction. Thus, sex-based rights protected in law can be done away with, end quote. Because gender-critical feminists believe that immutable sex-based differences require the continuance of female-only spaces, like bathrooms and locker rooms, in which trans women would be unwelcome because they are still biologically male, I think a reasonable person can conclude that, yes, they are being literally trans-exclusionary. But I don't think it necessarily follows that they are acting out of malice or bigotry. Like the trans activists, the gender critics have complicated reasons for believing what they do. Clearly, the dispute between trans activists and gender critics boils down to whether biological sex or gender identity has primacy in how we identify people. I don't have a dog in that race. But as an outsider looking in for the past 2 weeks, I'm frustrated that these two historically oppressed groups are fighting each other. There ought to be a rock-solid affinity between the transgender and feminist communities, but there isn't. And I think both parties bear a share of the blame for that. Whether or not J.K. Rowling herself is transphobic, it's true that her essay was cited approvingly by many unquestionably transphobic people, which only added to the quote-unquote toxicity that Rowling decried in her essay. It's also true that some feminists have made ill-advised decisions to ally themselves with politicians who oppose legislation expanding transgender rights in the USA, UK, and Australia. On top of that, anti-trans groups have been pursuing a divide-and-conquer strategy vis-a-vis the feminist, lesbian, and transgender communities, attempting to erode their solidarity by exploiting the fissures regarding gender identity. And I must say, the argument that real women need to be protected in locker rooms from men with hairy balls and penises posing as women strikes me as the kind of cultural fear-mongering often employed by right-wingers. Exclusion isn't the answer. It wasn't so long ago that black women weren't allowed into white-only locker rooms, and openly gay women were excluded as well. I think it's a bad look for feminists to associate themselves with arguments like that, especially since there are accommodations like locks on bathroom or changing room stalls that either already exist or can be implemented easily to make the concern largely disappear. So that part is mostly on feminists. But I'm also concerned about statements like the one I saw in a YouTube video posted in response to Rowling's essay, made by a young trans activist who said, quote, "Gender identity is what you are, and saying otherwise is transphobic," end quote. This statement has implications for children. Allow me a terribly simplistic example to illustrate my point. If you're a boy who likes to knit and bake brownies, but the only role models you have for that behavior are women and girls, your child brain might deduce that your gender identity is female and you are a girl trapped in a boy's body. But maybe you're just a boy who likes to knit and bake brownies. Boys can do those things, even if all the experience of their immature gender identity suggests otherwise. Is that gender dysphoria, or is our sexist society complicit in the discomfort felt by that boy? And similarly, so-called tomboys aren't necessarily trans men in waiting. They might simply be girls who like to do things that our profoundly fucked up, misogynist, patriarchal culture identifies as boy things. In that context, I think a sweeping pronouncement like gender identity is what you are, and some of the things we do in service to that pronouncement, like administering puberty-blocking hormones to some prepubescent children who report as gender dysphoric, can be just as harmful and dangerous as the biological essentialism it's meant to address. The trans activist side's proclivity for making statements like that and for describing people with words like TERF that they wouldn't use to describe themselves troubles me. Take another popular word these days, cisgender. The HRC glossary defines cisgender as, quote, a term used to describe a person whose gender identity aligns with those typically associated with the sex assigned to them at birth, end quote. Whoever coined that word would probably say it includes you and me. But does it? I'll speak for myself now. Beginning in my teenage years, and for much of my adult life, I struggled with reconciling my gender identity, the feeling I had inside me about who I was, with traditional conceptions of manhood and masculinity. Sure, I conformed ostensibly to my assigned sex, but I didn't conform in some very important ways. Men were the ones who prioritized their careers and making money. Men were the ones who asked women out on dates and always made the first move. Men were the stoic ones who gritted out their problems. Not this man. Using the vocabulary of trans activists, my gender identity didn't align with many of the characteristics associated with the sex assigned to me at birth, and this was the source of great suffering for me, especially in my teens and 20s. I think it would be awfully presumptuous of anyone to call me cisgender. By HRC's definition, I'm not clearly cisgender. And it's not helpful to pigeonhole people like that.
Right. I went through many of the same things as I was growing up. I go through many of those things today. I think probably one of our problems as a society is that we think of male and female as a binary instead of as poles upon which everyone falls at some point within the continuum.
Yeah.
To pull a Harry Potter reference, this is not a sorting hat scenario where you're assigned to Slytherin or Gryffindor by what the sorting hat says to you on your first day of school. Your identity is a product of biology and your upbringing and your interests and your tastes and the things that feel comfortable, and everyone is going to be somewhere different within that scale.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, though I respect the reasons that the various sides feel strongly that gender identity is determinative or biological sex is determinative. I'm dispositionally inclined to have a live and let live posture about that, but I think it's unhelpful the way the parties assail each other. And speaking of unhelpful phenomena, Mark, I want to make one other point. As we tape this episode of Mansplaining, the two wings of the Congressional Democratic Coalition, the moderates and the progressives, are feuding over the details of President Biden's Build Back Better agenda, with the fate of our nation seemingly hanging in the balance. In that context, let's think about what's happening between feminists and trans activists. In the social media fever swamp, J.K. Rowling, an ardent progressive and genuine feminist who puts her considerable money where her mouth is by supporting charities working on women's and children's issues, is branded a TERF, a bigot, a clear and present danger to trans rights. Meanwhile, the troglodytes among us who think of trans people as perverts, who believe in gay conversion therapy, and who pass Sharia-type laws controlling women's bodies are given a veritable free pass. As the British journalist Suzanne Moore put it, quote, "It is not feminists who murder trans people, although this might be the impression you would be left with if you relied solely on Twitter for your information," end quote. The left is notorious for eating its own, so we shouldn't be surprised by this behavior, but it still sickens me. Trans activists and gender-critical feminists, both doing the brave and important work of pointing us toward a more just and tolerant world, are on the same team, and they should be cutting each other some slack, trying to resolve their differences in good faith instead of fighting internecine TERF battles on social media. I'm reminded of the words of Rodney King. Can we all get along? Can we? Can we get along?
I would like to think so. There is one thing I'd like to return to, and maybe you came across it, which is a very frequent justification among the trans-exclusionary crowd is women's safety. That there's a risk if these spaces are opened up to trans women, that women will be bodily at risk of rape, at risk of murder. Did you see anything within your reading to either support or question that claim? Because I hear the claim way more often than I hear statistics to support it.
The only evidence I saw to support that claim has to do with prisons, that there are apparently some prisoners who were allowed to self-declare their gender and were actually in prison for sex-related crimes, identified their gender as female, and were put in women's prisons where they proceeded to rape some of the female prisoners.
Yeah, I also heard about that.
That really happened.
That really happened, and that is horrible. But is there any basis to think that non-sex offending trans women are a significant threat to women within women's spaces?
I don't believe there is any evidence to suggest that.
Right. So that strikes me as more just, like you said, it's kind of a fear-mongering tactic, like, oh, we got to keep all trans women out because maybe there will be one or more trans woman who's just there under a pretext. And it reminds me a little bit of Donald Trump's claim that Mexican immigrants are rapists and murderers. And his supporters can definitely pull out examples from the news of illegal immigrants who did commit terrible crimes. But the vast majority are just here to work and earn some money and take care of their families. And so the question is, do you keep all immigrants out because some immigrants might commit crimes? Or do you refuse to paint the majority with, guilt by association with a small minority who might have done something reprehensible? Certainly within the immigrant camp, I feel like that question is clear. I feel less comfortable saying that about women's restrooms because, of course, it's easy for me as a man to say, oh, yeah, that's not a problem. Just deal with it because I don't have to face that. So I feel less comfortable there. But I think when you think about it in the abstract, it does feel like a questionable claim that the fact that you can cite one or two examples of a trans woman who attacked a woman, that doesn't paint every trans woman with that brush.
Yes, I agree with that. And I think you've correctly homed in on the weaknesses of the trans-exclusionary argument when it comes to places like changing rooms, bathrooms. I think it's a much more complicated debate when we get to the issue of gender identity writ large. I'm very sympathetic to the feminist argument that gender is the axe that was used to oppress women for many, many years. And in telling that anecdote about my own teenage years was to say that I am a feminist ally in that gender roles were used to oppress me too and stunt my development. And so it's a hard thing to wrap my brain around as a son of a second wave feminist who grew up learning that gender is a social construct and believing that, truly believing it, to have a movement come along and say, no, gender is real and it's the most important thing and it's even more important than sex differences. And we should be legislating based on self-declaration of gender. That's a hard concept to wrap my brain around. And I think that's another reason why there's this fissure between feminists and trans activists.
I feel like I see that a little bit differently, which is that I am totally on board with gender as a social construct. I think that's undeniable. Anyone who's studied history knows that gender is 100% mutable. From period to period, from society to society, gender is all over the map. And yet where I go with that is that if gender is essentially this arbitrary construct, then that means that individuals should be free to identify with the gender that they find most comfortable. I cannot follow the feminists in saying that gender is a social construct and therefore biology is immutable, and also biology is expressed through gendered behaviors, one of which is which bathroom you use. I feel like that argument kind of doubles back on itself. And also, I feel like I'm generally coming out on this podcast on the side of the trans community. And maybe it's because there was an example in Seattle a couple years ago that was kind of formative for my preconceptions on this, in which there was a program in the Seattle Public Library by which trans women read stories to children. And it was at various branches of the library. It was a regular thing. And the Women's Liberation Front, which is a radical feminist organization, pressured the library and tried to get them to cancel it, simply on the basis that it was trans women who were reading these stories. And so I look at that, and there was no aspect of safety to this. This was not a women's space. It was a library reading room. It was simple hostility to the trans community that seemed to be motivating that. And so I feel like there's a lack of candor and probably more discomfort with the concept of trans women. That I feel like there's segments within the TERF community that just do not like trans women per se, and it doesn't really have much to do with defending women's integrity.
Yeah, I hear you. I don't know what to say because I'm torn myself. So I will say this. I think it's important to note that disputes about who is and is not a woman are raging not only in Seattle libraries and in academia and among activists on Twitter. At the just concluded Tokyo Olympics, a trans woman was allowed to compete as a weightlifter in the women's division, while the South African runner Caster Semenya, who's an intersex woman who won the gold medal in the women's 800 meters in the 2016 Olympics, was not allowed to compete at her championship distance in the Tokyo Olympics. So I feel like sports is already the next battleground in this war.
Yeah. And if I can take it to a very meta level, I feel like we are in a transitional point. I mean, I did not use the term transitional as a deliberate pun on this conversation, but maybe it should be. There's this book that I read back in grad school called Purity and Danger by Mary Douglas. And I feel like everyone should read this book because I have never found any book that I've read to be more relevant to more situations within the world than that. So let me say the title again, Purity and Danger by Mary Douglas. And that's a very brilliant anthropological study of what happens when people encounter things that do not fit into the categories that they have assigned to the world. For instance, there's a chapter within the book on Leviticus and the dietary restrictions and how you can make sense of what's clean and unclean within Leviticus simply by putting the foods into a grid and seeing that the authors of Leviticus said, these are the categories by which we understand the world, and anything that doesn't fit neatly into this category is by definition unclean. So outliers are unclean. You can see that all the time with something like the food that we eat today. My sister used to host exchange students from China, and these Chinese students found peanut butter and ice cream disgusting. Meanwhile, my other sister has stories about traveling to China for work where she was served food that she found disgusting. And there's nothing intrinsically disgusting about food. It's just that is our typical response to something that is outside of our categories of what food represents.
Right.
And so I think this is what we're going through right now in this historical period with trans men and trans women, is that this is our response to people and things that challenge the categories that we have for the world. And one of those categories is men and women. And trans men, trans women, they stand outside that category. They challenge the categories themselves. And unfortunately, a typical human response to that is, at its most extreme extent, disgust and hatred. And I think what we're seeing bubbling up within a lot of the opposition to trans rights is just simply people who are not comfortable with something that is challenging categories which they thought were endemic to the world. And they're more invested in the category than they are in accepting the people around them. And so the hopeful twist to that is when you get used to peanut butter, you're not disgusted by it anymore.
Right.
When you get used to ice cream, you realize that it's delicious. And so I believe that give it 10, 15, 20 years, people are going to move on. They're going to accept that people are going to be people, and we'll move on to the next thing.
Yeah, and we have a precedent for that in gay marriage, which was arguably the thing that lost John Kerry the election in 2004, and then kind of was instituted all over the country within a generation after that, because people just got used to the concept.
Yeah. We are profoundly uncomfortable with things that challenge our world, and then those things become part of our world.
Yeah. Good conversation.
Yeah, thank you for taking me through it.
You ready for your question for next time?
I am ready.
All right. I want to steer us away from some of the doom and gloom of our last few topics to something different. Self-driving cars. We've been told seemingly forever that driverless cars were just around the corner, And those promises are still being made today, but we never seem to turn that corner. I'm beginning to think of driverless cars as this generation's new Coke, an update of a wildly popular product that's destined for failure. You remember New Coke, right?
I do, yeah.
Came out when we were in college. It was a colossal bust, and it no longer exists. So, Mark, here's my question to you. Are self-driving cars New Coke or the real thing?
Okay, well, thank you for asking that, because you probably didn't know this, but I have been fascinated by the topic of self-driving cars and have followed that industry carefully over the last 10 years or so.
Oh, great.
There'll be a lot to jump into.
Yeah, I hit your sweet spot. That's great.
Okay, so if you have any thoughts on this episode or would like to leave comments on previous episodes, please come by our Facebook page, which you can find at Mansplaining Podcast. I hope you do come by and give a like to our page, leave comments or questions. And if you do pose a question, we might just make it into a future episode. If you'd like to help other people discover this podcast, then the best way to do that is by leaving us a rating and a review. You can do that on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts. That's it for this week. Thank you for spending your time with us, and I hope we can see you again soon.
And the artist formerly known as Joe may or may not talk to you later.
Bye, everybody. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.